Hey guys, welcome back to Saving Green. Today we're going to talk about what you need to think about before you go solar and how to crunch numbers for yourself. All right, so if you're watching this video, you have thought about solar panels and you're intrigued and you think it may be a good idea, but you may not be sure. So I know that when my wife and I were deciding whether or not we would go solar, it was a pretty daunting task. There were a lot of different companies to shop around, and there were a lot of different rebates and incentives. Plus, we didn't quite know if the panels were going to be worth it, and that's what we're going to help decide today. So the first thing I recommend doing when you're looking to explore a solar option for you is to check your credit, because these panels are very expensive as upfront costs, but with competitive financing, it definitely helps, and it's important to have good credit before you go down this venture. And it's also important to know that if you are currently paying a mortgage on your home, which most people are, you want to make sure that there's not going to be any other liens or other issues that if you're subsetting your costs to this new large home improvement project, that it's not going to compromise your ability to pay off your mortgage, which is incredibly important. And you have to talk with your lender first to make sure that this is something that makes sense. Along the same lines, talk with your financial advisor as well, if you have one, just to make sure that you can make this work financially for you. So after you check your credit, you also want to look at any state or local incentives. In Florida, we don't have any. But we also are a really good state for solar because we're the sunshine state, obviously. So that means that everyone should have solar, right? Well, not necessarily. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on where you live, the size of your roof, the orientation of your roof, the angle of the roof, which is called the azimuth angle, and whether or not there actually is exposure. It's a lot of stuff. So the question is, how do you even know? Well, Google has a way to help. So Google has a project called Project Sunroof, and if you Google Project Sunroof, you're going to be taken to a web page. I'm going to show you now what that looks like, and that web page will give you a bit of some information to kind of get you started. Okay, so I opened up the web page on a separate browser, and you can see here that I typed in some random address. So this is 123. I don't know. My apologies if you live at this address, but nonetheless, just pick something. So what does this Project Sunroof tell you? Well, it gives you how many hours of useful sunlight per year, which is actually kind of a good number to know. Because what that does is if you divide that by 365, it tells you how many useful hours of sunlight per day your particular house has. And if you look at the picture of the house here, this heat map, what it does is it shows on the southern end of the house, it's bright yellow. Well, bright yellow means that if you look at the grid at the bottom, it's really sunny in that spot. So you're going to get a lot of light exposure for this particular property. So would I put solar panels on the north, south, east, west? Clearly south here. That's what it shows on this address. Now, if you scroll up a little bit more and you look at, for example, this property here that's in the center of the map, well, it seems to be split, and there really isn't any sunlit exposure on your roof. So you'd have to choose between west and eastern exposure for that example. So now the other thing that Project Sunroof tells you is how many square feet of roof tiles you actually have. And this is important too, because looking at the amount of roof space you have as a square foot amount will give you some information and give you some help to determine how efficient each panel needs to be. Now, there's been a lot of great improvements in panels these days. And the improvements in efficiency means that you can get more watts per square foot, which is good to know. So then we go down to the important stuff, and this is where you would type in at your address what your average monthly utility bill is for electricity. So let's say, for example, your bill is $150. If your bill is $150 a month, that equates to 11.5 kilowatts, which is the total number of watts that you need in your panel size. Let's say that there is, like in our situation, we have 400 watt panels, which are quite efficient. So 400 watt panels, well, if we have 11.5 kilowatts, what does that equate to? 11.5 kilowatts times 1,000, or 11,500 watts divided by 400, that means we need 28 or 29 panels on our roof. So depending on the size of each panel, we can get a rough estimate of how many watts we're getting per panel. And that's another important thing to know. Other fun things that this tells you is not only an estimate of what your kilowatt roof tile size is or how many panels you may need, but it gives you some other helpful things to push you in that direction. For example, you're going to be saving 11.1 metric tons of carbon dioxide or CO2 per year, and how many passenger cars the equivalent is that you're going to be taking it off, and it just gives you some information that's kind of useful. It also will tell you in your geographic area, your neighborhood, how popular solar is and whether or not there are a lot of other roofs in the area that seem to work out, and it gives you just some helpful things you can play around with. For example, the average kilowatt size per roof or per household, the total amount of solar energy generated in this particular area, and then what the potential impact is both with commercial and residential solar projects. And scrolling down even more, you get to an estimate of what your upfront costs are, what your payoff schedule is, and what your savings are over the course of 20 years. And this is the important thing too, because again, the purpose of this channel is to save some green, right? We want to make sure that if we're going to make these decisions, that it makes sense. So here it's saying $27,000 of upfront costs after incentives, and then 20-year benefits. Well, how do we get those numbers? Well, Google also tells you that your actual panel installation cost is $38,000. That's a lot. But fortunately, in 2019, you got 30% back from the federal government. Now they're rolling back and scaling back. So in 2020, that drops to 26%. 2021 will drop to 22%. In 2022, drops to 10%. So now's the time. This is a good time to start thinking about it. So we got a rough estimate of what our upfront costs are. Then the other thing that's really nice about this particular display, this breakdown, is that it tells you the upfront cost of installation, the time it will take to pay this off, the federal incentives and how those are factored in, and then what your total costs are compared to what your utility company would be charging you over that same period of time. And here you can say, well, with solar over 20 years, we're actually paying about $31,000 worth. Or the same thing if you include a 2.2% annual increase based on inflation of what your utility company is going to be charging you, you actually would be paying $44,000 in that same period of time. So over that 20-year period, you'll be saving about $13,000, okay? So that's great. That tells you, based on this particular address, and you would crunch the numbers here, you would start here first for you. Does solar make sense? So that's the first thing. So you've checked your credit, you've gone to Project Sunroof, and now you say, okay, this maybe makes sense, but does it really make sense? How do I know that this is right? How do I know that this actually is the way that it is? So then you got to get your next step in this process is to go and log on to your utility company, sign up, and look at your actual energy uses. So in our particular case, this is our last year's payment. Now what's noticeable about this particular graph that you see is that if you look May, June, July of last year, the green or the usage drops off to gray in March. What happened in February? We got our solar panels installed. So you can see already the utility company actually dropped to negative, meaning we were generating more money than what the utility company was charging us. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that in the next video. So now we have an average, and this is what you want to look at ultimately. You want to either look at your last 12 months of your utility bills, or you want to log on to a web portal like such as this one, and you want to figure out what your average kilowatt hour usage is. So in this case, 2474 is the average kilowatt hours. Okay, so what does that mean? The watt is the amount of energy produced. Basically, it's the amount of power being generated in terms of joules per second, okay? So in typically utility companies, a watt is such a small denominator that basically they look at kilowatts and they look at kilowatts generated per hour. So to convert watts per kilowatt hour, you actually have to multiply by 60 for 60 seconds in a minute, and then 60 again for 60 minutes in an hour, or other words, 3,600 to convert from watts to kilowatt hours, okay? And then you basically divide by 1,000, and that will give you your kilowatts per hour, okay? So 2474 is your kilowatt hours per month. So what do we do with that number? Well, 2474 kilowatt hours per month, we go back here to our trusty calculator, and 2474, we divide by 30 on average. So that's 82.46 kilowatt hours per day. Cool. So if that's the amount of time that you need per day, then you got to figure out, well, approximately how much of that per hour. Well, you can divide again by 24. It's about 3.4 kilowatts per hour. Great. But the number that we really want to look at is this one, because that's the daily requirement. And the reason why this is important is because, yes, it's nice to know what your average kilowatt usage is over the course of each hour, but in reality, it's sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, it's going to fluctuate. So the question is, how many hours per day are you actually using the grid to its fullest potential? And the rule of thumb is somewhere between 5 and 8 hours a day, okay? So that means that depending on your area, and again, looking back at that solar graph number, if we look back over here and we say, okay, according to Google, I have 1790 useful solar hours per year. Well, what does that mean per day? Okay, so let's go back. So we know that we have 82.4 kilowatt hours per day, but we also know that we have about 1790 total sunlight hours per year, divided by 365, which is about 4.9, or like I was saying, about 5 hours per day. 5 hours of sunlight per day actually means that we have to generate the full 82,000 watts or 82 kilowatt hours in only 5 hours of sun exposure, because that's really how this ultimately needs to work out. So how do we get the number of panels or total kilowatts that we're able to produce? Well, your grid is measured in watts, and the multiple of watts that you have, however many panels you have, is going to be a sum in kilowatts. Not kilowatt hours, but kilowatts. Which means that for every hour of sun exposure that those panels are experiencing, they're going to generate that amount of energy. So if you have a 1,000 watt panel or a 1 kilowatt panel, and only one of them, and you have 1 hour of sunlight per day, you will generate 1 kilowatt. If you have 5 of those panels in 1 hour per day, you'll generate 5 kilowatts. If you average that over the course of 3 hours of exposure, then you multiply accordingly. But you have to realize that you don't get the full benefit of 24 hours of sunlight per day, clearly. And what the Google site shows you is where you are specifically about how many hours per day you're going to be generating. So the goal is to take your total kilowatt hours of production, divide by the number of hours of productive sun exposure, and that will give you kilowatts, which is the sum total of the panel size that you need. So in our example, if we have 82 kilowatt hours per day, and we divide by the number of viable hours in that day, which is about 5, then we need a panel size of about 16.4 kilowatts. That means that 16.4 kilowatt grid is going to be generating, over the course of 5 hours of productivity, about the total energy use that we need for that day. Now keep in mind, some days you're going to get 7, 8, 9 hours of very effective energy production. And in some hours, in some days in the wintertime, you may generate much less, maybe 2 or 3 hours of productive days. Some days you'll never generate that full level of efficiency, whether it be because it's raining, or there's snow covering your panels, or whatever. A lot of birds have pooped all over your panels and you got to clean that off. All those things are going to impact the amount of production that you're getting. But this is just an estimate, just so you can come in to the conversation and understand where this number is coming from. Now we know that the total panel size is 16.4 kilowatts, but what's a good estimate of what that actually is in dollars? Well, to estimate your upfront cost, again, going back to Google, now we can see here that according to this, the solar panel costs of an average size home are about $15,000 after solar credits or incentives, but it averages out to about $3 per watt or $3,000 per kilowatt. So again, going back to our trusty calculator, that means that 16.4 kilowatts times 3 is about $49,000, okay? So $49,000 is gonna be the number that you're actually gonna need to look at and think about whether or not you can price this out. So now the question is, okay, $49,000 is a huge upfront cost. But again, if you take advantage of solar incentives from federal tax rebates, what actually happens is Go to the IRS website and talk with your accountant and basically find this form here, this 5695 form. This is last year's form, but it's the same for this year in 2020. And basically what you would do is you would fill out your total electric property cost, and you'll see here that they're saying that this is a 30% rebate. Now what is this tax rebate is? Well, it's really a tax credit. That means that depending on your tax liability, you will get that credit back. So now we know that the total cost of the panel size is about $49,000. We also want to budget in what our actual upfront cost is going to be minus the rebates or federal tax credits. So that means that we multiply our number in this case by 0.26 and almost $13,000 back. Well, are we going to actually see all of that back? Well, it depends on your credit, your tax liability. So depending on your gross income and your tax bracket, married, deductions, all that good stuff, you talk to your accountant and say, well, how much in taxes am I paying per year? If you're paying more than $12,870 in taxes in that calendar year, you're going to get all that back essentially, and you're not going to owe anything. Furthermore, you may actually owe less, or your total income may be less than that. And in that case, then you would divide this out and you would get the maximum amount of your exposure per that year. And I think you have 3 years to use all of this credit back. So that means that as long as you owe, more in taxes than $4,000 a year or $5,000 a year, you're going to get all of this back at some point, and you shouldn't owe any additional taxes for that year. You may even get some money back. All right? So now let's think about the total amount of money that we're ultimately going to be putting into this thing. So let's say $49,500. Let's say the interest rate may be 4%. And let's say that this is over 20 years, okay? So now we actually realize, okay, our total interest is going to be $39,000. That means that our total investment cost is actually $89,000. That's quite a bit. So $89,000, 100 over the course of 20 years means that we have to figure out, based on our monthly payment, whether or not this actually makes sense. So we got $89,000. We're getting about $12,000 back from the federal government. So over the course of 20 years, we're paying $77,000. We have to divide that by 20 years. That's the amount of money that we're paying per year, or $3.85 thousand, okay? So if we do $3.85,000, then we divide that by 12, we're paying $320 a month. $320 a month is actually going to be what our annualized cost is going to be per month. Now, if this number is less than your monthly payments on utility bill, solar makes sense. If it's more than that, then it doesn't make sense. And that's the bottom line. So that's how you can basically figure out whether or not solar works. So it's not that simple, but it's also not that complicated. You just have to understand where the numbers are coming from, and you have to kind of come into this situation when you start getting contractors out to your home with a little bit of an understanding as to what you might be getting into. In our situation, the cost of our solar panel array ended up being pretty expensive as a total end value. However, after the federal rebates and after our interest was factored in, we ended up paying a lot less than we would per month if we had kept our utility bills at the present rate. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was a way for you to get a sense as to what is involved in going through the math with doing a solar panel assessment and whether or not it makes sense for you. So that's it for now. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about our experience with solar so far and how it's been paying off. Hey guys, thanks for checking out Saving Green. Have a great day.